around. So I actually thought most of y'all would have early voted by now. How many people still have to vote on these constitutional amendments?
Still have to?
Yeah, yeah, still have to. Okay, well, good. So it's a lot like, I'll be honest, I haven't voted either. I don't tend to early vote because I have a voting place that really just 3 houses down from me. There's an old school, so that's where I vote. So I actually like going, enjoy it. But you know, reading up on the constitutional amendments, people like me put it off until after Thanksgiving because you were busy, and then we had all this special session going on. So like, what's going on? And if you start skimming them, you're like, wow, these are some either inside baseball or really arcane constitutional amendments. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad constitutional amendments, but it does mean they're some of the most difficult, particularly that fourth one. I will tell you, at the 10 years I've been at PAR, that is the most complicated constitutional amendment I've ever had to deal with. Again, not saying it is a bad constitutional amendment, but it is rough. So let me talk a little bit about the Constitution in general, and then we'll start going through it. And then afterward, I know there'll be plenty of questions, and if we can, we'll probably even answer some broader questions because I know we had the session wrap up, so I'll be happy to answer questions about that, though I didn't study up for that. All right, so we had our Constitution in 1974, and since then we've had 316 amendments that have been proposed to the voters since 1974. And in this year that grows to 321 with the 5 y'all had to vote on. Of those, 217 if you just count the coastal one that passed last month. So that's 217 out of 321 amendments that have been proposed, and we still have 4 more to vote on. Over 50% of the amendments that have been proposed since 1974 have been in Article 7. Now, Article 7 is the tax and spending articles. That's where you find a lot of your dedications. It's where you find a lot of sort of the tax code in terms of what can you change, what can you not change, what's the maximum rates, how much has to go to particular funds. The biggest, most eye-popping stat to me about the need for constitutional change is that the 1974 Constitution, the Article 7 is about as long as the original 1974 Constitution. Just that one article, we have 14 articles, that one article is about as long as the entire rest of the Constitution was when it was first passed, including the Article 7 when it was in there. So that shows you just how much we put into the Constitution that probably should be put into statute. Now, some of the issues are, I'm not telling you to vote against constitutional amendments. Some of the issues is that if you want to change anything, then you need a constitutional amendment to change them, including taking stuff out of the Constitution. So we're kind of in this bind. So that was sort of a general set of what we're doing. So let's talk about the 4 that you have to face on December 7th. Coming up quick. All right, again, the first 3 are kind of inside-y baseball. They're not particularly difficult, but it's not necessarily something you know at the top of your tongue every time you talk about it. The first one, Amendment number 1, is the expansion of the Judiciary Commission. And I'm going to say multiple times Judicial Commission because it sounds better, but the official word is Judiciary Commission. Just know, I've messed it up multiple times. So for those of you that don't know, the Judiciary Commission is the entity, the constitutional entity, that investigates judges for misconduct. So they investigate judges of all levels, and then they make a recommendation and a report to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court is the one that actually takes disciplinary action. Right now, there are 9 members of the commission. There are 3 that are judges and appointed by judges, and then there are 3 that are attorneys, but not judges. And then there are 3 citizen members. So it's 3, 3, and 3. The proposed constitutional amendment does a couple of things. One, it moves the membership from 9 to 14. And here's how that works. So they're going to keep the current 9, and then they're adding 5. They're going to add 2 members who are appointed by the House, 2 members that are appointed by the Senate, and the governor gets to appoint 1. So you have that 5. Now, there's no particular requirement on those 5. They could be attorneys, they could not be attorneys. They technically could be judges, although I seriously doubt it. I don't know that they would do that. The reasoning behind that is they think, okay, look, this is a little bit too inside baseball. These are people that are attorneys or judges, make up 2/3 of the court, and citizens are only 3 people. And we're worried that there may be too deferential to the judges and attorneys that are working on this, particularly when they're investigating judges. This is against a backdrop of concern that the Judiciary Commission is not investigating cases quick enough, and some of these cases linger. As sort of give you a reference, they had about 380 cases, complaints that were brought against judges in 2023. So it's it's hundreds of complaints each year that they have to process, and some of the defenders of the system say, well, look, that's a lot of complaints. So yeah, we're not going to get through all of them in a year. But then people say, look, this is important. Some of these things are dragging on too long. So that's some of the impetus for trying to change this. Another thing is that the Judiciary Commission can be directed by the Supreme Court to start an investigation. Right now, the Supreme Court can't say, hey, go investigate this judge. We heard bad things about them. Now, they may do that informally, but they don't do that formally. So they can now formally ask for a recommendation, formally say, Judiciary Commission, go investigate this judge if this passes. The last major change is that the Supreme Court can then also temporarily disqualify a judge. They can say, hey, look, you can no longer serve or do the duties of that office while the investigation is going on. But the judge would still receive a salary. So the best analogy I have for it is if you've heard of the concept of leave with pay. It's essentially, we're investigating you, so you're going to be disqualified from the office because we think you have a possibility you had some sort of misconduct. So the Supreme Court will have that ability, but in the meantime, the judge would still receive pay. So those are the proposed changes. I kind of gave you the reasoning behind them in terms of like, well, look, we think this will get more transparency because you're going to have some more non-lawyers probably on there. Some of the concerns or arguments against was that, well, this could politicize the system because now you're getting political appointees. They will be appointed by elected officials, and so do they have a particular agenda? Everyone sort of seems to say that right now there seems to be no sort of partisan or political agenda that happens on the Judiciary Commission. At least that's from former members of the Judiciary Commission who testified to that end. One of the other arguments against is that if you really want to speed up the investigations, hire more investigators. They only have one full-time investigator that actually does it. So if you want to speed that process up, then hire more staff. And that's the one investigator, and they have, I think, 4 or 5 attorneys that also help go through the process. So that's sort of the counter argument to that. So that's overall this one. Relatively easy one, although a little bit inside baseball if you're not a judiciary follower. All right, let's go through the next 2. Very much go together. You have amendment number 2. And amendment number 2 and 3 are both by Representative Bacala from here in Ascension Parish. It would mandate upon final passage of a budget bill, of an appropriations bill. So final passage, that's kind of not a legal term, it's sort of a term of art. So right before if the Senate and House votes voted on it, it would become law and sent to the governor. That's what we mean by final passage. So this final passage also can mean something else. But so, okay, last time you're going to vote on and if it passes here, then the legislature doesn't get to see it again. When that happens, you have to have 48 hours and a summary report and the amendments before the legislators can vote on it if this constitutional amendment passes. This is really harkening back to last year, not earlier this year, but last year when at the end, members of the legislature got the bill with amendments on it from conference committee. There were only a couple of hours left in the session, and they didn't know what was going on. They had to vote for it anyway because who knows what was going to happen. You know, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. Particularly the rank and file legislators, including senators, were very upset with how the process was handled. So this is an attempt by Representative Bacala to be like, okay, let's fix this. So this would require at least 48 hours after amendments and a summary report have been given before legislators can vote on final passage. Not all the different steps that the bill has to go through, but the final last time. And it only applies to appropriations or budget bills, not everything else. All right, and so you can get the arguments for and against. Like, you understand why they were doing it. They want to make sure legislators understand what they're doing before they vote on something. Makes sense. On the other hand, it's like, well, you should be able to manage your own business better. You know, don't vote for it, or make sure they get it to you sooner, or handle this through either the rules. And by the way, there is a rule already exists that says they have to have 48 hours, but it's one that can be waived, and it can be waived with only a majority vote. So maybe you do a state law or something else before you go to a constitutional amendment. Not to mention the pressure that if you have to wait 48 hours, well, now you might actually end up running even more into time, because now you need 2 days in advance before the end of session. And what if one house passes it, one doesn't? So to deal with that, you have Constitutional Amendment number 3, which allows the legislature to extend the regular session. So they can extend the regular session by 6 days, 2 days at a time, if they haven't passed a budget bill. So this only applies to budget bills again. So it's not like, you didn't get, some sort of, or it's a highway bill would count. But there is some other change in the law or something along those lines. This doesn't apply to it. And you can only take actions on budget bills during this extended session. So it would be 6 days, 2 days at a time to pass additional budget bills. Similar arguments, and again, these are by both of the same author, dealing with the same issue. Is like, we don't have enough time at the end of the session. Bills are hoisted on us. We don't know what's in there. So you had 48 hours before you have to do it, but then you might run out of time. So this is sort of the, well, if you're running out of time because you can't deal with it, then we have this in our back pocket so that, we can take an extra 6 days if we need to end up passing bills. So that way, if you put 2 and 3 together, you have a sort of more time to review it, and then you also have more time to actually sit down and pass bills. Same sort of arguments against it, though, is like, no, get your job done while you're there, and you should be able to manage your own business. In terms of cost, it's pluses and minuses. On the one hand, doing this, extending it by 6 days, could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars because you have staff working. On the other hand, if the legislature doesn't get their job done and they don't pass a budget bill, then you got to come back in special session, which would actually be longer and therefore costlier, because you'd have to start the whole process again. The bills would have to be reintroduced, and they have to go through the House and committees, and then the floor, and then the Senate committees, and then the floor, and then whatever conference. So that actually could easily take more. In fact, it would have to take more than 6 days, just the way we have 3-day requirements for each bill. So I can't tell you which one is going to cost more. There's arguments for and against both of them. While those bills are philosophically linked, they are not legally linked. You can pass number 2, which gives them a requirement of 48 hours to think about it, but not give them the extras, 6 days, and vice versa. So you could end up with something where you have the extra days, or you have the extra time requirement, but you don't have the extra leverage to try and get it done. So they'll really have to manage their time there. So one can pass without the other. They are not legally linked. All right. This next one is rough. Okay. Anyone in the audience happen to be a land title attorney? No. Okay. I guess we're out of luck in one sense, because it would be nice to have someone. On the other hand, it frees me up because maybe you won't know if I'm saying anything wrong. This one is the most difficult one to write about as par. It is looking at a complex system, and it has another solution for it. It's not a minor tweak. It's sort of redoing the system. So the topic is tax sales as opposed to sales tax, right? Sales tax, we know, we understand that. You go and you buy something and you get a percent and you have to pay it. These are tax sales. So if the owner or owners of a property have unpaid property tax, then under the current system, you have to wait a prescribed period. Then the government that they owe the money to can put that sale up, that property up for auction, and then they sell that property. And at that point, the original owner or owners can come back, and they'd have 3 years to, essentially buy their property back for the auction price plus penalties and interest. So you can buy your property at auction, but you don't have clean title to it. Is essentially one of the issues. But eventually, if you wait enough, you have your own property, and then you can put it back into commerce. And that's basically how the current system works. 2 problems with the current system. And it's a little more complicated than that. I'm going to say depending on how the auction goes, you not necessarily buy the entire property. You'll buy a percentage of the property if you pay less than what the property is worth. And that goes back to agricultural times, when you could actually easily divvy up. Someone owned 100 acres and like, oh, well, it's worth $100,000. You owe us $10,000. Well, I can just give you 10% of my acres, that kind of thing. It's a little harder when it's a house or a building that you own a percentage of it. But that's still part of the current system. Okay, 2 issues. One is the current system is very difficult if you have multiple owners. And this can frequently be the case with abandoned property, because you might have a family that owned the property, and then both of the owners die, and so it would pass to their kids or their grandkids or their second cousins. And so you might have, in some cases, 10, 12, dozens of owners of a property, particularly if it's been abandoned for a long time, which particularly after Katrina, people found out how difficult this is to try and put property back into commerce, because you had wiped out property, wasn't being used for anything, and you were trying to put it back. And if you do it as part of the process, if you leave out any of these owners in terms of notifying that the property is going to be up for auction, then the whole thing is subject to risk of being nullified, the whole process. So that's one of the issues this tries to deal with the process. The second issue is, and there was a Minnesota case. It says, okay, if you're going to take someone's property, the government can't unduly benefit from it. Another way to put it is, I'll give you an example. Say the property is worth $100,000, and there's $30,000 worth of debt on it. That includes penalties and interest. So it goes to sale. Someone buys it. Someone buys it for the $30,000. So a person lost their house that's worth $100,000 for $30,000 worth of debt. And then when the new owner sells it, they have a $100,000 house. Essentially, the original owner had a $70,000 taking, in a sense. They took more than the government was allowed to take. And so they said that was unconstitutional. Says you can take the $30,000. Yeah, they owed you that money. You can't take the whole house just because they owed you something less than the house. Now people will say that does apply to Minnesota. We have a slightly different system. And although people say our current system has a lot of problems. So what was the proposal to move to? So the current system is a house sale or a property sale system. You get ownership of the property if there's a debt. If there's a debt, you can put the house up for sale. Someone buys that property. The new system is a lien system, where someone is not buying your property at auction, they're buying a debt on your house. So instead of being the whole $100,000 house that's up for sale or for auction, it's the $30,000 in debt. Or really it's the $20,000, but eventually be worth $30,000 of penalties and interest. So we essentially just auction off that portion of the property that's unpaid, the unpaid debt, so the amount. So now someone now is owed $30,000. The original owner can come back and buy that at any point and say, okay, look, I owed the government $20,000 with penalties and interest, and I waited a couple of months, maybe 2-3 years. So now I owe you $30,000. Here's the $30,000. I've cleared my debt, and then it's done. If they don't do that, then in 3 years or more, the owner of the debt can force you into foreclosure and say, okay, we're going to force you to sell your property. It's going to be like a mortgage, right? If you don't pay your mortgage, the mortgage company can force you into foreclosure. And then they sell the property. And then here's what happens. Whatever money they get, whoever does the auction, usually a sheriff, gets some administrative fee. Then the next amount of money that goes to pay off the lien holder. So that money gets paid off. And then there's any other liens, like say, the county or the parish has to pay off your grass cutting lien or something like that. Those get paid off, and then any money left will go to the original property owner. So they still have some ability to reclaim some of the equity in that house. Not all of the money went to go pay for their debt when it was in excess of their debt. All right. That's just explaining the system. So we move from you lose your whole house and it gets auctioned off process. Someone gets to auction off and then buy your house versus we're going to auction off the debt. Now, the equivalent, you still might lose your house, but if the house goes up for sale, you still get some of the equity if there's anything left after the debt is paid. So it's a very different system. The second system is a little bit more protective of the original owners in the sense that they get some of their money back if more than the amount to pay off the debt comes out of the house sale. So it's a little more protective that way. There are arguments between lots of different title attorneys that say, okay, is this faster or slower? Some of the people against it were saying, okay, look, this is actually going to take a little bit longer. It's a new system. You have to wait and see. People say, well, it might be a little bit slower, but I don't know that that's true because there are a lot of things that can really slow you down, particularly in the notification phase of the current system. So you might have to do it all again if you had faulty notification. The second question would be, all right, what's better for redeveloping property if you have a lot of abandoned property? And again, people differ. Some people say, well, look, because it might be slower, it might actually, moving to the system might put people off from doing this. Plus, let's be honest, the current system might actually be a benefit to people who are going to buy it because not only do they get to pay their debt off how much they auction the price for, they might get a whole house out of it depending on how the auction went. Although that might be unconstitutional. But some of the people say, well, look, it's going to be a different type of people that come in because some people might come in and if it's a cleaner process, they'll be more likely to put their money into it because it's going to be cleaner and a little more standard. You don't have as much legal risk when you go and buy someone's house. And so in that case, it might be more attractive to investors. I can't tell you which way it is. I'm just telling you that there are arguments on both sides. And whether it makes the Land Title Association, the people who brought the bill, because they thought this was a better process, and they were a little worried about the constitutional challenge if the Supreme Court ever takes it and makes it a national finding. So, all right. That is one of the more complicated ones I've ever gone through. Hopefully, I have elucidated. It's essentially changing it from where you buy someone's house and the house has to go up the sale, was where you buy someone's debt, and then you can force them to sell their house to pay off that debt, but any leftover money they get to keep. All right, so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, of which I'm sure there are many. And if we get through the constitutional amendment questions, I'm happy to talk about the tax session we don't have. With warning, I don't have all it in my head. I didn't study for that for this one. So there's still a lot of questions about that we're trying to figure out too. So who wants to start with the questions? Okay.
The first one, the expansion of the Judiciary Commission.
Okay.
The 9 current members, or the way it's structured now, where do those names of those nominations
See, that's an easy one because I actually have it. So the question is, of the 9 people on the Judiciary Commission, who nominates the 3, 3, and 3? Okay, I have it right in front of me. That's a great question. All right, so you have, from the 3 judges, you have 1 Court of Appeal judge selected by the Supreme Court, 2 district judges selected by the Supreme Court, and then 2 attorneys who have been able to practice law for at least, 1 Court of Appeal judge, 2 district judges selected by the Supreme Court. So there's your 3 judges. So 1 Court of Appeal, 2 district judges, the Supreme Court picks them. Then the attorneys are 2 have been able to practice law for 10 years, selected by the Conference Court of Appeal judges. And then you have 1 attorney who's been able to practice law for at least 3 years, but not more than 10, who's selected by the Conference of Court. So they have some experienced attorneys and some less experienced attorneys on there to get a mix. And then you have 3 people who are not lawyers, judges, or public officials. They are selected by the Louisiana District Judges Association.
So people submit names to each of these organizations, or how do they?
I don't know where then those organizations get their names from. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there is necessarily a process because they're selected by organizations. So the Supreme Court probably has a list of names that they're getting, whether there's a formal process or not.
But they have nothing to do with the court system, the 3 citizens.
Well, I don't want to say they have nothing to do with the court system, but they're not lawyers, judges, or public officials. So they might be, I guess it's technically possible that they could, I don't know, they could be a notary public or something like that. But that's not typically who's been on those right now. The idea is they're trying to pick citizens. But now they're usually people that are civically engaged or involved, or business owners. It tends to be who they are. All right.
Where do the assessors stand? I know you talked about the planning board, but where do the assessors stand on number 4?
So where did the assessors stand on the 4th Amendment, which was about the tax sales? I don't know. I didn't see any assessors testify in the first Senate committee meeting. And actually, the people that testified against it they were like former land title folks or people that ran auctions. I didn't see any assessors one way or another. I'm not saying that some parts of one of the committees, especially when they got to the House, they didn't have some testify, but I think most of those people understand, most of the red cards kind of went away as this moved through the process from the people that understood it. But I don't think assessors had an opinion one way or another. I might be wrong on it though, but I didn't see any.
During the legislature, were the constitutional amendments, all 4 of them, I'm thinking, were they just smooth sailing, or was there opposition, and how much of it to? I mean, as far as
So the question is, how much opposition was it as they moved through the legislative process?
Like the votes.
You know, oftentimes I'll go back and check like the average time an amendment spent in committee, like in minutes, because it can be lightning quick. I will tell you for sure that number 4 wasn't lightning quick. It was about 2 hours worth of testimony in the Senate the first time they heard it, and about 2 hours in the House. So those were very long, and some of it because it's very complicated. You have a lot of questions, and there were 2 bills. And that's actually, let me come back and get that. There was the constitutional amendment itself. Something that number 4 does, and something one of the original opponents of the bill said, is like, look, number 4, the constitutional amendment, moves a lot of the constitutional language dealing with tax sales out of the Constitution and puts it in statute. The only complaint on that particular one that some people said is that it doesn't move enough out of the statute. So if you want to move stuff out of the Constitution, probably just looking at that by its own criteria, you're probably a fan of number 4, because then you can change a lot more of this. The constitutional amendment itself is pretty short. It moves a lot of things out. So there was a lot of testimony on that one. The other ones there was testimony on, I think they moved a lot quicker. I can't say that they were had no opposition though.
What about the 2/3 vote required of the legislature? Were any of them close to get them to the voters?
I have to go back and check I don't think on final passage they were close. But I'd have to double check. I don't think these were, some of you got some more controversial opinions. I think a lot of the issues got smoothed out by the time they were on final passage. So I don't think it was too close. But I don't have those numbers. I hate to say that.
Anything in the just, in the special section linked to or in Dawn passage of any of these?
No. So the question was, is anything in the just passed special session linked to the passage or I guess failure of these amendments you just talked about? So no. So these will go into effect. They actually had, I'm trying to remember which one it was. There's actually, I think, language in the proposed constitutional amendment that sort of dealt with one of these, dealt with like the article, no, because they already had it. Because there was the one that dealt with the coast. It was like, depending on how that passed, they needed to rewrite that. But then they knew that it passed, so they were able to then incorporate that change into the constitutional amendment. So, but yeah, otherwise this shouldn't matter in terms of what they're doing. The only one, let me see. Hold on. Yeah, so the Greg Miller, number 4, actually amends Article 7 as well. But I don't think it touched anything that the constitutional rewrite of Article 7 touched. So it should be fine, but it's something like I need to go back and check and see, okay, in the proposed Article 7 rewrite, how does this address this? I'm pretty sure they put some contingencies in there, like that adopted the language if they put it in there. But I'm not sure. I don't know, we haven't really, we went through it, looked at Article 7 and we were following it the whole way, but they made, some amendments in the Senate. And we're going to do our guide to the constitutional amendments for March too. So I'll have a better answer for that question next year. Oh wait, let's get this one. Yes.
When do these go into effect?
Yeah, I don't know the exact date of when they would go into effect. I'd have to look at the bills. We don't have that in our guide. I think they go into effect when it passes. So I think they'll start January 1 in terms of when. The only one I'm not sure about that is the Senator Miller number 4. I don't know if there's a transition time there or not. That's the only one I don't know. The other ones, I think they will be in place for the session coming up next year.
If in that scenario you outlined, if 2 passes and 3 fails, what will be the net effect difference under that scenario versus where we are today?
So, okay, so to back up, so what happens if 2 passes and 3 fails? And so 2 requires 48 hours on final passage before the legislators can vote on a budget bill. And they have to have 48 hours from getting the amendments and from getting a summary document. So they got to wait 48 hours now. And this is in the Constitution. They can't get around that with a rule suspension. So they're going to be jammed up. There's 2 days they have to wait. So it'll have to be at least 2 days ahead of the end of session. And so if 3, which is the one that would give them an extra 6 days, doesn't pass, means it's completely possible you might see more sessions end without passing budget bills. And it could be more special sessions. I don't know. Or it could mean they manage their business and they start passing budget bills with at least 48 hours to go. Was there a particular scenario you had in mind?
No, but I'm wondering with that, if that is the case, would it have not seemed to have made more sense to merge the 2 into one amendment?
Yeah, they seem definitely linked, but so I can't speak to Representative Bacala on why he wanted to break it separately, but he did want it separately. I suspect what his reasons might be, but I wouldn't want to speak for him.
The Judiciary Committee members are full-time jobs?
Let me check.
And would you have an idea of the size of their staff?
Yeah, the staff I think is I want to say 5 people. I want to say it's 4 attorneys and an investigator, or it might be 5 attorneys and an investigator.
So there's 9 members and 5 staff members?
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know that they get paid anything except maybe like a per diem for travel type of thing.
So the proposal is to go to 14 to keep staff constant?
Well, now the staff could be increased by legislative action, right? That doesn't necessarily need to require a constitutional amendment. But there didn't seem to be a whole lot of discussion about increasing the staff instead of doing this. But that doesn't mean they don't do it as well. But to do that, they would have to come up with additional money in the judicial budget to pay for it.
So some more commission, and let's just for no staff.
Now, I don't think, like, so for example, the judges, I'm positive they don't get paid for serving on this. I think the other ones, I think they probably only get like a per diem for travel or something along those lines. I'm not positive, though. Yeah.
So with the just concluded special session, what is first take on the outcome? How do you feel about what they accomplished, or what didn't they accomplish that you thought they needed?
So that's okay. So we're switching. If we're good for constitutional amendments, so on the special session on tax reform, plus a couple of other things, how does PAR's take? I mean, we're still digesting it. Honestly, there's a couple of things we're still trying to figure out. Broadly, we were probably a little bit more in favor of the original proposal than how it ended up in the legislature, because that would have taxed services. And not to say that bill was perfect. You had some issues with some like tax pyramiding and some business to business, but that would have been, I think, better than the increase in sales tax. That's really what you're trying to do, and it's as it isn't perfect, but generally you try to increase the base and have more people paying, but paying a lower rate. And we ended up basically, because we didn't expand the base, we had a higher rate. Now, they were never really considering expanding the base and lowering the sales tax, so that wasn't even a possibility. But instead, what they ended up doing, because they didn't expand the base, they had to increase the sales tax to sort of make it roughly revenue neutral, question mark. The cost is another issue, and we were talking about that before we started. Is this going to be more or less money for the state? And the answer is yes. It is very complicated how we've looked at it because it has to do with time. Well, one thing has to do with time. So you get some things that maybe cost money at the beginning, but by the end of maybe 5 years, it actually starts bringing in more money. Corporate revenue is one of the big examples there because of the way the tax credits process, the fiscal office was concerned a lot of people are going to cash in on tax credits, and it'll take time to work out through the system of the additional restrictions. So that's one that changes over time. Then you also have I'll call it the color of the money. So for example, they got rid of the franchise tax, which PAR thinks was a terrible tax, and I'm glad we got rid of it. But it was about $400 to $500 to $600 million it was bringing into the state through this tax. But because that money was all going into a revenue stabilization fund, and sort of as a secondary backup savings fund, it was never hitting the general fund, so it wasn't like the budget will feel it because it wasn't getting spent. So how do you count that? Do you take, well, we lost $400 million, or you don't count it at all? And then you add the dimension of time over there. And that's before you even get to the complexities of trying to forecast it, because you look at things like digital services, they can get a pretty good idea. But you've changed the corporate system, you now have a new income tax system, and you have sales tax changes. All of those things together, and I don't think anyone in the fiscal office of the Department of Revenue would say otherwise. There's just a lot of, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of what that will end up doing. So there is no bottom line number. Kind of what everyone in the legislature on every side seem to agree is going to be roughly revenue neutral. And maybe they have secret conversations with the fiscal office that we didn't see. But if you if you kind of piece together, I see what they're saying in terms of where they're getting it at, but there's no spreadsheet that shows that to you. You kind of have to look at it. And there are just problems. Some of the fiscal notes were written in a way that they don't anticipate the effect of other things. So, for example, the digital goods bill, or the digital sales, assumed the 4.45 rate, but since we're going to 5%, it's leaving money off of the table. That probably will bring in more money than the fiscal note says. So it just becomes very complicated. And that's one of the things that PAR is really looking at when the revenue estimating conference comes in. What are they going to do and say our official forecast is? Because they now have to do this, the constitutional body that looks at this and says, okay, what does this mean? And we now have to come up with official predictions. So I'm sure they are busy working with their staff. So that's done by the governor and really through his commissioner of administration and their economist, and also the fiscal office, their economist, and they're going to try and figure it out and present to the REC. So I'm waiting for that meeting to really see what the official forecast is, and still knowing that it's still a forecast. Every forecast is subject to variability. This one probably more so than most.
With regard to the collapse of House Bill 9, having spoken with a number of people who would have been directly impacted by that bill and having to collect sales taxes for the first time, I can tell you there was a perception out there that, rightly or wrongly, that this was being targeted at the, quote, small guy, the small fry. And their belief was that if it should apply to them, it should apply also to attorneys, to accountants, to advertising firms for which the lawyers use, i.e. the billboards out there, the television ads to the trial lawyers. They feel like they should have been into this too, and thereby perhaps there would have been a lower rate. Just like the second major thing was they thought it was a big windfall to local governments. Would you care to comment on that?
So this is, to clarify, this is the proposed bill to add sales tax to services, or to a lot of services. It wouldn't have been all services, but it was a lot of them. And it included a lot of things, but some of the things it didn't include were attorneys and accountants. It did include lobbyists, though. I will say the governor made a big point of it was affecting lobbyists. So it did include those. Now, there are two reasons why it didn't include attorneys and accountants, or attorneys and accountants. The policy reason is what happens if you do business-to-business transactions is that it ends up with tax pyramiding. So let's say you have a business, and okay, look, they sell to people, but they need to hire an accountant to do their work. So that accountant now has to charge them a sales tax. But sometimes that accountant has to go to a tax attorney and says, okay, I need you to help interpret this law. So the tax attorney tax on I'm rounding off to 5% sales tax. And then that gets passed on to the accountant. So now they're going to pass on that 5%, but they're going to add an additional 5% on top of that to the business. And the business is then they were going to charge sales tax anyway, but now they have to account for in their prices the additional 10%, 11%, that they had to have from the other businesses passed on to the final product. So that's tax pyramiding. So generally, you want to try to avoid tax pyramiding. And that's why a lot of business-to-business things got exempted. You saw some of that because there was a lot of concern over construction, too, because construction is like, well, look, I now have to get this in my business. But the more practical side point is that attorneys and accountants would have pushed back, and I don't know that they could have gotten a bill passed if they included those particular ones. A lot of the things that they did include, though, I will say, are taxed in other places like Texas. I mean, they basically used Texas as the model and said, okay, here's the things we're going to tax. And there are reasons you would exclude things that are really business-to-business transactions, which is mostly what accountants, not necessarily personal accountants that help do your taxes, but the vast majority of accountants that aren't doing that are working for businesses directly or indirectly. So that's why they didn't include it. I do understand the need that if some of these smaller businesses didn't collect taxes before, then it would be a transition to try and figure out, okay, how do I file these taxes? And so I do think that was an issue. That being said, I think that's something that could have been handled. PAR, by the way, pays sales taxes When we sell our guides to the constitutional amendments, we charge for those, and then we collect sales tax and we remit it. You know, we're not a huge organization, but we were able to handle it. So, we getting close? One last question.
I think it's never a hard job, I believe, to engage public sentiment on it, but the fact that none of this ever even included looking at things like, for instance, something similar to the quail tax that we had before, or processing tax. Can you comment on whether, you know, that still might be something to be looked at to get some of these things?
You talking about like the oil processing? Yeah. Yeah, I think some of that. Yeah, it's a lot of what they did in this current session. They looked at what a lot of other reports said, and so they were pulled some stuff that PAR did, that Cable did, that Lobby looked at, that the Tax Foundation and other national groups maybe looked at and said, these are some things you ought to do. And so they kind of took all that as their first cut, and then they refined it and refined it and refined it, or messed it up, depending on your point of view, after that. So I don't think that particular proposal got a lot of play, so I didn't think it made it into what they were looking at to begin with. So that's not to say that that wouldn't be something that they would look at. So, for example, digital goods are something that a lot of people have said we ought to charge sales tax on digital goods. If you went to Blockbuster and, you know, rented a movie, you would have gotten charged, or bought a movie. But if you buy it online, you're not paying sales tax. Why? So I think that was sort of more justifiable compared to some of these other ideas.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you all so much. Always fun to be here.